Welcome to Mr. Nightgrim. Every small town has its secrets. Some just do a better job hiding the bodies. Tonight we start going deeper than rumors and fireside tales. These are the 10 true small town horror stories, the ones that never made the news but never went away. Subscribe before your signal fades. Drop a comment, where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? Just curious, sometimes these stories hit hardest after midnight when the clocks don't tick quite right. Let's begin. The radio crackled to life at 11:47 p.m., same as it had every night for the past 3 weeks. Static first, then that voice, gravelly, familiar, in a way that made Ranger Tom Hendricks' skin crawl. "Tom? You there, Tom?" Hendricks stared at the radio mounted on his desk in the ranger station, a converted trailer that served as the only law enforcement outpost for 60 square miles of Montana wilderness. The voice knew his name, knew his schedule, knew exactly when he'd be alone with nothing but the hum of the ancient refrigerator and the tick of the wall clock for company. He'd stopped answering after the 5th night. Stopped, but never stopped listening. "I know you're there, Tom. I can see your light." Hendricks glanced toward the window. His station sat in a valley surrounded by pine-covered slopes, miles from the nearest neighbor. The old hunting cabin the voice claimed to call from had burned to the ground in 1989. He'd seen the blackened foundation himself, overgrown with wild grass and mountain laurel. Nothing but a stone chimney and scattered debris remained. Yet every night, same time, same frequency, the radio technician from Billings had checked his equipment twice. Everything worked perfectly. The frequency was clear, unused by any other station within a 100-mile radius. "You remember me, don't you, Tom? From that night in '89? Hendricks' hand froze over his coffee mug. He'd been a rookie ranger then, 23, and eager to prove himself. The call had come in around midnight. Hunter reported gunshots from the old Mackenzie cabin, up Devil's Gulch. Hendricks had driven the winding mountain road alone, following the beam of his headlights through thick forest. The cabin had been fully engulfed when he arrived. Orange flames licked at the night sky, sparks spiraling up toward the stars. He'd circled the building, calling out, but heard nothing over the roar of burning timber. By morning, nothing remained but ash and questions. No body was ever found. No identification of who might have been inside. The fire investigator ruled it electrical, old wiring in an old cabin, case closed. "You didn't look hard enough that night, Tom." The voice was clearer now, as if the speaker had moved closer to his microphone. Hendricks could hear something else in the background, a sound like wind through trees, or maybe water running over rocks. "I was trapped in the basement, Tom, calling for help. You walked right over me." Hendricks grabbed the radio with shaking hands. "Who is this? How do you know about that night?" Silence, then soft laughter that made his teeth ache. "You know who this is?" The lights in the station flickered. Through the window, Hendricks saw his patrol truck's headlights flash on and off, like Morse code spelling out a message he didn't want to understand. "I never stopped calling, Tom, never stopped trying to get your attention." Hendricks remembered now, the reports that had trickled in over the years. Hikers claiming to hear voices from the ruins of the cabin. Hunters finding fresh footprints in the ash. Even decades later, he'd dismissed them all, filed them under tourist imagination and too much whiskey around the campfire. "The basement, Tom. You need to go back to the basement." There was no basement. Hendricks whispered into the radio. The foundation was solid concrete. "Look again." The radio fell silent. Outside, an owl called from somewhere up the slope, its voice echoing off the canyon walls. Hendricks sat in the sudden quiet, listening to his own heartbeat, remembering. The next morning he drove up Devil's Gulch for the first time in 20 years. The road was worse now, pitted with potholes and choked with fallen branches. Twice he had to get out to move deadfall, blocking his path. The ruins looked smaller than he remembered. The stone chimney stood like a lone sentinel among the overgrown foundation stones. Wild roses had claimed most of the debris, their thorns glinting in the morning sun. Hendricks walked the perimeter slowly, noting details he'd missed as a young man. The foundation wasn't solid concrete, it was mortared stone, and in several places the mortar had crumbled away. Near what would have been the back corner of the cabin, he found it a gap between 2 foundation stones just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. He knelt and peered into the darkness below. The smell that rose from the opening was wrong. Not earth in decay, but something else. Something that reminded him of electrical fires and burning hair. "Hello, Tom." The voice came from directly below him, clear as if the speaker stood at his shoulder. Hendricks jerked backward, nearly losing his balance on the uneven ground. In the darkness below the foundation, something moved. "I've been waiting so long for you to come back, waiting to show you what you missed." Hendricks fumbled for his flashlight, hands shaking. The beam revealed stone walls descending into a space that shouldn't exist, a room carved from the living rock beneath the cabin. And there, in the center of the earthen floor, something that might once have been a man. "I tried to call for help that night, Tom. Tried to reach my radio, but the fire moved so fast." The thing in the basement raised what remained of its head toward the light. Where eyes should have been, there were only dark sockets that seemed to drink in the flashlight beam. "I never stopped trying to reach you, Tom. Every night for 34 years. Calling and calling and calling." Hendricks scrambled backward from the opening, but found he couldn't look away from those empty sockets. "Now you know," the voice continued, though the mouth didn't move. "Now you can finally answer." The radio in Hendricks' truck began to crackle, then the one back at the station miles away, then every radio in the valley, all tuning to the same frequency, all carrying the same message. "Tom, you there, Tom?" Hendricks ran, but the voice followed him down the mountain, transmitted through every speaker, every radio, every electronic device capable of receiving a signal. It followed him home, followed him to bed, followed him into dreams where he walked endlessly through a burning cabin, looking for a basement that was always just out of reach. He never answered the radio again, but every night at 11:47 he listened, knowing that somewhere in the darkness below Devil's Gulch, something was still calling his name. The Montana State Police found Danny Reeves on Tuesday morning, walking barefoot down Highway 2 near the old Copper Creek exit. His feet were torn and bloody, his work clothes hanging in tatters, and when Trooper Sarah Martinez approached him, he looked at her with the confused expression of a man who'd woken up in a foreign country. "Sir? Sir, are you all right?" Danny, though he wouldn't remember that name for another 3 days, stared at her as if she were speaking underwater. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words in a language that sounded like gravel being poured through a sieve, full of clicking consonants and vowels that seemed to come from the back of his throat. Martinez had been patrolling this stretch of highway for 8 years, ever since the mining boom went bust and left half the mountain towns empty. She'd seen plenty of strange things, drivers who swore they'd been on a different road entirely, hikers who emerged from the wilderness, speaking of lights in the sky, entire families of tourists whose GPS units had guided them to roads that didn't exist on any map. But she'd never seen anything like this. "What's your name?" she asked, speaking slowly and clearly. The man tilted his head like a bird hearing an unfamiliar song. He pointed to himself, then spoke again in that alien tongue, the words tumbling over each other in a rhythm that almost sounded like music. Martinez called for backup and an ambulance. While they waited, she tried to piece together what had happened. The man wore the uniform of Mountain Valley Electric Company. She recognized the logo stitched above the breast pocket. His work boots were missing, but she could see the tan lines on his feet where they'd been. Most telling of all, he carried a leather tool belt containing wire strippers, electrical tape, and a voltage meter that looked like it had been through a blender. The ambulance took him to Mercy General in Great Falls, where Dr. Patricia Wong spent 6 hours trying to understand what she was seeing. The man's vitals were normal, his reflexes intact, his pupils responsive to light, but his brain scans showed activity in regions that shouldn't have been active. Areas associated with language processing were lighting up like Christmas trees, while the sections responsible for memory and personal identity remained mysteriously dark. "It's as if someone rewired his neural pathways," she told Martinez during one of the troopers' visits. "But that's not medically possible. The human brain doesn't work that way." On the 3rd day, pieces of his original identity began to surface. He remembered the taste of coffee, the feel of copper wire between his fingers, the sound of his truck's engine turning over on cold mornings. By the end of the week, he could speak broken English again, though he still lapsed into that otherworldly language when he was tired or stressed. His name was Danny Reeves. He was 34 years old. He lived in a converted Airstream trailer outside Whitefish and spent his days installing power lines in the remote corners of Montana. He'd been driving to a job in the old mining town of Silverdale, taking the shortcut through Glacier Pass to save time. When what? That's where the memories ended. No matter how hard he tried, Danny couldn't recall anything after seeing mile marker 13 flash past his windshield on that Thursday night 3 weeks ago. Martinez launched her own investigation. Danny's truck was found a week later, abandoned on a fire road 15 miles from where he'd been discovered. The vehicle was in perfect condition. No damage, no signs of a struggle, gas tank still half full. The keys were in the ignition, his thermos of coffee still sitting in the cup holder, still warm to the touch despite having been there for days. The fire road led to an old mining camp that had been abandoned since the 1950s. Silverdale, a town of maybe 200 people at its peak, now reduced to a handful of stubborn holdouts, and a post office that opened 3 days a week. Martinez had driven through it countless times, but she'd never bothered to explore the maze of service roads that branched off into the surrounding mountains. She followed the road where Danny's truck had been found, winding deeper into territory that seemed to exist in its own pocket of time. The trees grew differently here, twisted into shapes that hurt to look at, their branches forming patterns that almost resembled symbols or letters in an alphabet she didn't recognize. The air tasted of copper and ozone, like the moments before a lightning strike. At the end of the road, she found the mine. The entrance was sealed with concrete, but someone or something had broken through. Fresh concrete dust littered the ground, and Martinez could see gouges in the barrier that looked like they'd been made by massive claws. Beyond the opening, her flashlight beam disappeared into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow light. She called for backup, but her radio produced only static. The silence around the mine was absolute, no bird songs, no insect buzz, no wind through the trees. Even her own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself were holding its breath. That's when she heard it, a sound like voices calling from deep underground, speaking in the same alien language Danny had used during his first days in the hospital. The words seemed to rise from the depths of the mine, growing louder and more insistent, until Martinez felt an almost overwhelming urge to step through the broken barrier and follow the voices into the dark. She backed away instead, returning to her patrol car with the feeling that something vast and patient was watching her leave. That night, she dreamed of walking through tunnels carved from living rock, following voices that promised answers to questions she hadn't thought to ask. The next morning, she returned to the mine with a full investigative team. They found the barrier intact, no signs of damage, no concrete dust on the ground. Her flashlight revealed only solid concrete, unmarked and unbroken, as if it had never been disturbed. But Danny Reeves still spoke that other language in his sleep, still woke with memories of walking through endless tunnels toward a light that wasn't quite the right color. And sometimes, late at night when the hospital was quiet, the nurses reported hearing him have conversations in his room, long, animated discussions in that clicking musical tongue, as if he were speaking to someone they couldn't see. Dr. Wong tried hypnosis, but Danny only sank deeper into that other language, describing things that existed in the spaces between words. Martinez visited regularly, hoping to unlock the mystery of those missing 3 weeks, but Danny seemed to be slipping further away from the world he'd known, becoming fluent in realities that operated by different rules. The last time she saw him, Danny looked at her with eyes that reflected light like an animal's and asked, in perfect English, "Do you ever wonder what's waiting for us in the places we're not supposed to go?" Then he smiled, and Martinez saw that his teeth had grown sharper, more angular, better suited for a language that had never been meant for human tongues. The first time Father McKinnon heard the bells at St. Bartholomew's toll in the dead of night, he assumed it was the wind. The old church had been built in 1923 with a bell tower that caught every dust that rolled down from the Cascade Mountains, and the bronze bell inside had a reputation for ringing at odd hours during storm season. But there was no wind that October night. The air hung still and heavy over the town of Cedar Falls, thick with the smell of wood smoke and decay from the logging mill that had shut down 3 years earlier. Most of the town's 800 residents were asleep by 10 o'clock. There wasn't much reason to stay up late anymore, not with half the businesses boarded up and the nearest movie theater 40 miles away in Spokane. McKinnon was reading in the rectory when the bells began, 3 slow, deliberate peals that echoed off the empty storefronts on Main Street and seemed to hang in the air long after the sound should have faded. He set down his book and listened, waiting for more, but the silence that followed was complete. The next morning, he climbed the narrow stairs to the bell tower and examined the mechanism. The old rope hung motionless from the bronze bell, showing no signs of recent use. The bell itself was coated with years of dust and bird droppings, undisturbed except for a few spider webs that stretched between the metal and the wooden frame. That evening, he mentioned the bells to Martha Hensley, who ran the only grocery store still operating in Cedar Falls. She paused in the middle of counting his change, her weathered hands freezing over the register keys. 3 times, she asked. Yes. Around midnight, I'd say. Martha's face went pale. Mrs. Patterson heard them too. And the Kowalski boy, 3 times all of them said. She finished counting his change in silence, but McKinnon could see the worry in the lines around her eyes. Cedar Falls was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where a sneeze on one end of Main Street was front-page news by the next morning. The bells ringing in the night would be coffee shop gossip for weeks. But no one had died. That was the strange part, the detail that made the whole thing feel wrong. St. Bartholomew's bell had tolled for every death in Cedar Falls for 70 years, 3 times for each soul that passed, a tradition that went back to the church's founding. When old Henrik Johansson died in his sleep 2 springs ago, the bells had rung before anyone even found his body. When little Amy Chen was killed in a car accident on Highway 20, the bells tolled at the exact moment her heart stopped, 40 miles away in the hospital in Spokane. The bells knew. They always knew. But this time, no one had died. McKinnon checked with the county coroner's office, called the hospitals, even contacted the state police. No deaths reported in a 50-mile radius. Not so much as a cat hit by a car. A week passed quietly, then the bells rang again. This time McKinnon was ready. He'd been sitting in the sanctuary since 11 o'clock, watching the bell tower, waiting. The tolling came at 12:17 a.m., the same slow measured pace as before. 3 peals, then silence. McKinnon ran up the tower stairs, his flashlight beam dancing on the stone walls. The bell hung motionless, but something was different. The dust on the bronze surface had been disturbed, wiped clean in a pattern that looked almost like handprints. Handprints too large to be human, with fingers that were too long and joints that bent in the wrong directions. He told himself it was a trick of the light, but when he returned the next morning, the marks were still there. That afternoon, Martha Hensley didn't open her store. When McKinnon knocked on her apartment door above the grocery, she answered wearing the same clothes she'd worn the day before, her gray hair disheveled, and her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. "I've been thinking about those bells, Father," she said without preamble. Thinking about the pattern. She invited him in and showed him a notebook where she'd been recording the dates and times of the midnight tolling. 7 entries so far, each exactly 1 week apart, each at a different time between midnight and 1 a.m. "I called my sister in Portland," Martha continued. "Asked her to check the obituaries for us, see if maybe someone from Cedar Falls died away from home. But there's nothing, Father. No one's died." "Then why are the bells ringing?" Martha's hand shook as she lit a cigarette. "What if they're not ringing for people who died? What if they're ringing for people who are going to die?" McKinnon felt something cold settle in his stomach. "That's not how it works, Martha. The bells toll when a soul passes, not before." "But what if something's changed? What if whatever makes the bells ring is confused somehow? Seeing things that haven't happened yet?" The bells tolled again the following Thursday. This time McKinnon wasn't alone. He'd convinced Tom Bradley, the volunteer fire chief, to sit vigil with him in the sanctuary. Both men heard the 3 slow peals. Both saw the ancient bronze bell remain perfectly still throughout the tolling. "I don't understand it," Bradley whispered as the echoes faded. "The sound's coming from up there, but the bell's not moving." They climbed the tower together and found fresh handprints in the dust, larger than before, and accompanied by what looked like scratches in the bronze surface itself, deep gouges that spelled out letters in an alphabet neither man recognized. 1 week later, Henrik Johansson's grandson Eric was found dead in his trailer on the outskirts of town. "Heart attack," the coroner said. "Happened sometime around midnight." The bells had been silent. 1 week after that, Martha Hensley collapsed behind the counter of her grocery store. Stroke. She died in the ambulance on the way to Spokane at exactly 12:47 a.m. Again, the bells were silent. McKinnon began to understand. The midnight tolling wasn't marking deaths that had already occurred. It was marking deaths that had been prevented, interrupted, stolen from whatever force was supposed to claim them. He started keeping his own records, cross-referencing the times of the mysterious tolling with reports of close calls, accidents avoided, medical emergencies that resolved mysteriously. The pattern was there if you knew how to look for it. Eric Johansson had been scheduled to die 7 weeks earlier, but had recovered from what doctors called a miraculous cardiac episode. Martha Hensley had survived a minor stroke 6 weeks before her fatal one, walking away from the hospital with a clean bill of health that surprised everyone. The bells weren't ringing for the dead, they were ringing for the living, for people who had cheated death and upset some cosmic balance that required correction. And now McKinnon realized he was on the list. 3 nights ago, he'd swerved to avoid a deer on Highway 20 and barely missed the guardrail that would have sent his car tumbling into the ravine below. He'd laughed about it at the time, chalked it up to quick reflexes and divine intervention. But tonight, as he sat alone in the sanctuary, he understood that divine intervention came with a price. The bells would ring for him soon, marking him as someone who had borrowed time that didn't belong to him. Outside, midnight was approaching, and somewhere in the darkness above, something with hands too large and fingers too long was preparing to collect what it was owed. The bells began to toll, slow and measured and inevitable, counting down to a reckoning that could no longer be postponed. The ledger sat open on the front desk of the Red Hollow Motel, its pages yellowed and water-stained, the final entry written in blue ballpoint pen that had skipped and blurred with age. Michael and Sarah Chen, room 6, 2 nights, paid in advance. State Trooper Janet Walsh had seen the handwriting dozens of times over the past 6 months, photographed it, analyzed it, run it through every database the Montana Department of Justice had access to. The signature matched no driver's license, no credit card application, no hotel registry anywhere in the state. Michael and Sarah Chen, as far as the official record was concerned, had never existed. But someone had written their names in that ledger. Someone had taken their money, handed them a key, and shown them to room 6. And then 3 days later, the Red Hollow Motel had been condemned by the county health department and boarded up permanently. Walsh stood in the motel's parking lot, gravel crunching under her boots as she studied the building that had dominated this stretch of Highway 2 for 40 years. The Red Hollow had been a landmark of sorts, the kind of place where truckers caught a few hours of sleep between runs and traveling salesmen spent nights they'd rather forget. 24 rooms arranged in an L shape around a parking lot that had never quite been level, with a neon sign that flickered between vacancy and no vacancy depending on how the wind was blowing. Now the windows were boarded with plywood, and yellow tape stretched across every door. The neon sign had been dark for 6 months, its tubes broken, and its metal frame twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly. The health department had condemned the place after reports of a persistent odor and structural irregularities, but Walsh had read the real reports. The ones that mentioned room 6's carpet had been burned away in a perfect circle, leaving only bare concrete underneath. The walls showed scorch marks that followed no pattern fire investigators could explain, and the stain on the bathroom floor defied every cleaning product and chemical solvent the county had tried. Most disturbing of all, room 6's telephone had continued ringing for 3 weeks after the power was shut off. Walsh had her own key to the motel evidence room property technically, though the case remained officially open despite months without progress. She'd been the first responder when Betty Kowalski, the motel's owner, had called 911 in a panic, babbling about guests who'd checked out without opening their door, and a smell coming from room 6 that made her physically ill. The room was exactly as she'd found it 6 months ago. 2 suitcases sat on the bed, filled with clothes that could have belonged to anyone. Generic department store items with the tags still attached, sized for a man and woman in their 30s. The bathroom held travel-sized toiletries that had never been opened, toothbrushes still in their packaging, razors wrapped in plastic. But it was the stain that drew Walsh's attention, just as it had every time she'd visited this room. The mark on the bathroom floor was roughly the size of a bathtub, dark brown with edges that seemed to shift and blur when she wasn't looking directly at them. The county lab had analyzed samples and found traces of organic compounds they couldn't identify, proteins that existed in no known database, arranged in molecular patterns that shouldn't have been stable. "It's like someone dissolved," the lab technician had told her. "But that's not possible. The human body can't just liquefy like that." Walsh knelt beside the stain and breathed through her mouth to avoid the smell, sweet and metallic like copper pennies soaked in honey. The odor had grown stronger over the months instead of fading, as if whatever had created it was still active, still changing at a molecular level. That's when she heard the shower running. The sound came from directly behind her, the familiar whisper of water against tile that every bathroom in America produced. But there was no water pressure in the building. The utilities had been shut off months ago. Walsh turned slowly, her hand moving instinctively to her service weapon. The shower stall was empty, its fixtures dry and coated with dust, but she could still hear the water, could see steam beginning to fog the mirror above the sink. "Hello?" she called, though she knew no one would answer. The footprints stopped at the edge of the stain, then simply ended. No trail leading away, no indication of where the people who'd made them had gone, just wet marks on dusty linoleum, growing fainter as Walsh watched, evaporating into the motel room's stale air. She ran outside, gulping the cold mountain air and trying to make sense of what she'd witnessed. Her radio crackled with static when she tried to call for backup, producing only white noise and the occasional burst of what sounded like voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. That night, she dreamed of the Red Hollow Motel as it had been in its heyday, neon sign blazing, parking lot full of cars from decades past, music drifting from rooms where guests were checking in for stays that would never end. In her dream, she walked through the lobby and found the registration ledger filled with names in blue ballpoint pen, page after page of Michael and Sarah Chen, checking in over and over again, always asking for room 6. When she woke, Walsh found a business card on her nightstand. Red Hollow Motel, it read, with a phone number that had been disconnected for 6 months. On the back, someone had written in blue ballpoint pen, "We're still here. Room 6. Come find us." The handwriting matched the final entry in the motel's ledger perfectly. Walsh drove back to the Red Hollow the next morning, bringing a full forensics team and equipment to document whatever was happening in room 6. But when they arrived, they found the motel's parking lot empty, the building gone as if it had never existed. Only a concrete foundation remained, cracked and overgrown with weeds, with a single room-sized stain in the center that defied every attempt to clean or cover it. The county records showed that the Red Hollow Motel had been demolished in 1987, 15 years before Michael and Sarah Chen had supposedly checked in. But Walsh still had the ledger, still had the photographs, still had the business card that had appeared on her nightstand. And sometimes, late at night, when she was driving Highway 2, she'd see a neon sign flickering in her rearview mirror, vacancy and no vacancy, and hear the phone in room 6 ringing, waiting for someone to answer. Captain Jimmy Morse had been fishing the waters off Beacon Point for 37 years, and he'd never seen anything like the storm that appeared on the horizon that Tuesday morning in September. It materialized just after dawn, a towering wall of black clouds that stretched from the water's surface to heights that seemed to scrape the bottom of heaven itself. The storm was maybe 3 miles offshore, close enough that Jimmy could see lightning forking through its depths like electric veins, close enough that the thunder should have reached his boat within seconds of each flash. But the sound that came across the water wasn't thunder. It was something else, something that made his teeth ache and his fillings vibrate in rhythm with the flashing lights. "You seeing this?" he radioed to his cousin Paul, who was running nets about a mile to the south. Static answered him. Nothing but white noise and the occasional burst of what sounded like voices speaking backwards, syllables tumbling over each other in a language that predated human speech. Jimmy turned his boat toward shore, eager to reach the harbor before whatever was brewing in that storm decided to move inland. But as he watched, the wall of clouds seemed to be moving parallel to the coastline, neither approaching nor retreating, maintaining its distance like a predator circling prey. By the time he reached Beacon Point Harbor, half the town had gathered on the pier to stare at the phenomenon. Jimmy had lived in this coastal Oregon community his entire life, through El Niño years and La Niña years, through storms that had stripped the paint off buildings and calm seasons that barely produced enough waves to surf. He knew weather the way other men knew baseball statistics, could predict rain 3 days out just by tasting the salt in the air. But this wasn't weather, this was something else entirely. "Been sitting there for 6 hours, said Molly Patterson, who ran the Harbor Light Cafe and had the best view of the ocean from her dining room windows. "Hasn't moved an inch toward shore, but it hasn't moved away either. Just hangs there, flashing and rumbling." Jimmy borrowed her binoculars and studied the storm more carefully. The clouds moved in patterns that defied meteorology, spiraling inward toward a center that seemed to pulse with its own light, then exploding outward in tentacles that writhed against the sky before being pulled back into the mass. Lightning didn't flash randomly through the formation, but followed specific paths, tracing symbols in the air that almost looked like letters in an alphabet designed by something that had never learned to communicate with words. That evening, the town council held an emergency meeting at the community center. Mayor Davidson had been in contact with the National Weather Service, the Coast Guard, and even NOAA's Storm Prediction Center. None of them could explain what was happening 3 miles off the Oregon coast. "Radar shows clear skies," reported Fire Chief Martinez. Satellite imagery shows clear skies, but we can all see that thing out there, plain as day. Could be some kind of military experiment, suggested Pete Kowalski, who owned the marine supply store and had theories about everything from UFOs to government weather control, secret technology, electromagnetic warfare, something like that. But Jimmy had spent enough time on the water to know that the storm wasn't technological. It was alive in a way that human-made things could never be, breathing with the rhythm of tides that followed no earthly moon, pulsing with energy that made compass needles spin in fish finders, display readings from depths that didn't exist. The third night, the lightning began hitting the town. It started at the Morrison place, an old Victorian that sat on the bluff overlooking the harbor. At exactly 2:33 a.m., a bolt of electricity struck the house's lightning rod, but the bolt came from the clear sky above, not from the storm that still hung motionless offshore. The strike was precise, controlled, lasting exactly 30 seconds before vanishing, as if it had never occurred. The next night, the Chen family's house was hit at the same time, 2:33 a.m. exactly. Then the Kowalski place, then the Harbor Light Cafe. Each strike lasted 30 seconds, each came from a cloudless sky, and each left the buildings unmarked, but somehow changed. There's no damage, Fire Chief Martinez reported after inspecting the Morrison house. No burn marks, no electrical damage, nothing. But the house feels different inside, colder, and the shadows don't fall the way they should. Jimmy knew what he meant. He'd been in the Morrison place after the lightning hit, and something about the geometry of the rooms had shifted. Hallways seemed longer than they should be. Doorways opened onto spaces that were larger on the inside than the outside, and every mirror in the house reflected a version of the room where the furniture was arranged differently. By the end of the week, 13 houses had been struck, always at 2:33 a.m., always for exactly 30 seconds, always from a clear sky while the storm continued its patient vigil 3 miles out to sea. The affected families reported strange dreams, conversations overheard in empty rooms, and the persistent feeling that they were being watched by something that existed just outside their peripheral vision. Then the Hendersons disappeared. Tom and Linda Henderson lived in a small cottage on Maple Street, about 6 blocks from the harbor. Their house had been struck on Friday night, the same precise lightning that had marked the others. But Saturday morning, their neighbor found their front door standing open, breakfast still warm on the kitchen table, and no sign of where they'd gone. The police found no evidence of a struggle, no indication that the Hendersons had packed or planned to leave. Their car was still in the driveway, their wallets and identification still on the bedroom dresser. The only unusual detail was in the living room, where every piece of furniture had been arranged in a perfect circle around a space in the center of the room that felt somehow wrong, not empty, but occupied by something that cast no shadow and reflected no light. Jimmy volunteered to join the search parties that combed the coastal forests and beaches. They found nothing during the day, but at night, some of the searchers reported seeing lights moving through the woods, not flashlights or campfires, but something that pulsed in rhythm with the lightning that continued to fork through the offshore storm. On the 7th night, Jimmy positioned himself on the harbor pier at 2:30 a.m., determined to see exactly what was happening during those 30-second strikes. The storm still hung on the horizon, its clouds still moving in those impossible patterns, its lightning still tracing symbols that hurt to look at directly. At 2:33, a bolt of electricity descended from the clear sky above and struck the water just off the end of the pier. But this time, Jimmy was close enough to see what the lightning really was. Not electricity, but something else entirely. Something that looked like a bridge made of light, stretching from the sky down to the surface of the ocean, solid enough to walk on. And walking down that bridge, he saw them, Tom and Linda Henderson, moving with the measured pace of sleepwalkers, their eyes reflecting the storm's unnatural light. Behind them came others. People Jimmy recognized from old photographs in the Historical Society, residents of Beacon Point who had died years or decades ago, all walking down the lightning bridge toward the water. The procession lasted exactly 30 seconds. When the light vanished, the figures vanished with it, leaving only the smell of ozone and the sound of waves lapping against the pier. Jimmy never reported what he'd seen. How could he explain that the storm wasn't weather at all, but a doorway? How could he tell the town council that their missing neighbors hadn't disappeared, but had been collected, gathered up by something that had been waiting patiently just beyond the horizon for people to be marked by its precise surgical lightning? The storm remained for 3 more days, then vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. The morning sky was clear, the ocean calm, and life in Beacon Point returned to its normal rhythm. But Jimmy still watched the horizon, and sometimes, on nights when the moon was dark and the tide was turning, he could see a faint glow 3 miles offshore, pulsing with the patient rhythm of something that had learned to wait. And he knew that someday, when enough houses had been marked and enough people had been chosen, the storm would return to collect what it had claimed. 10-year-old Marcus Brennan started digging in his family's backyard on a Tuesday morning in late June, 3 days after a dream that left him shaking and covered in cold sweat. His mother, Elena, found him at dawn with her gardening spade, creating a hole near the old oak tree that had shaded their property for longer than anyone in Millbrook could remember. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" she asked, though something about the focused intensity in her son's eyes made her reluctant to interrupt. "I have to dig here," Marcus said without looking up from his work. "Something's buried here, something important." Elena Brennan had lived in this house for 15 years, ever since she and David had moved to Millbrook with dreams of raising their children in a small town where everyone knew each other's names and doors were left unlocked at night. The northern Minnesota community of 800 people was exactly what they'd hoped for: quiet streets lined with maple trees, a main street with a hardware store and a diner, and enough farmland surrounding the town to make a person feel connected to something larger than themselves. But Elena had never seen her son behave like this. Marcus was usually content to spend summer mornings reading or building elaborate structures with his Legos. He'd never shown any interest in gardening or outdoor projects, and he'd certainly never attacked the hard-packed earth of their backyard with the single-minded determination of a man possessed. By noon, the hole was 3 feet deep and perfectly round, as if Marcus were following some invisible blueprint. His father, David, came home for lunch and found his son still digging, the garden spade now abandoned in favor of a hand trowel that allowed for more precise excavation. "Marcus, that's enough," David said. "Come inside and eat something." "I can't stop," Marcus replied, his voice strangely flat. "Not until I find it." "Find what?" Marcus paused in his digging and looked up at his father with eyes that seemed older than his 10 years. "The thing that's been calling me." That night, Elena and David discussed their son's behavior in hushed tones after Marcus had finally been coaxed inside for dinner and a bath. The boy had eaten mechanically, answered their questions with single-word responses, and gone to bed without his usual complaints about bedtime. But when Elena checked on him at midnight, she found his bed empty and heard the sound of digging coming from the backyard. Marcus was back at the hole, working by the light of a flashlight, his pajamas dirty and his hands bleeding from the rough work. The excavation had grown deeper, maybe 4 feet now, and perfectly cylindrical. At the bottom, Elena could see that her son had uncovered something wrapped in what looked like oilcloth. "Marcus, you need to come inside right now," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I found it," he whispered, his flashlight beam playing over the wrapped object. "I found what was calling me." Elena grabbed her son's arm and pulled him away from the hole, but not before she saw that the oilcloth package was moving. Not wind-blown movement, but a slow rhythmic pulsing like something breathing. That night, Marcus slept deeply for the first time in a week, but Elena and David lay awake listening to sounds coming from the backyard, soft scraping noises, as if something were trying to climb out of the hole their son had dug. When morning came, they found the excavation filled with loose earth, as if it had never existed at all. But the package was gone. "Did you take that thing out of the hole?" David asked his son over breakfast. Marcus looked confused. "What thing? What hole?" The boy seemed to have no memory of the past week's obsessive digging. He spent the day playing normally, building a fort out of couch cushions and reading comic books, showing no interest in the backyard or any mysterious objects buried beneath their oak tree. But that night, Elena woke to find her son standing at their bedroom window, staring out at the backyard with an expression she couldn't read. When she followed his gaze, she saw that the hole had reappeared, deeper than before, and something was moving in the shadows at the bottom. "We need to leave," Marcus said quietly. "Tonight, now." "What are you talking about, sweetheart?" "It's awake now," he continued, his voice carrying an adult understanding that chilled Elena to the bone. "I dug it up, and now it's awake, and it's hungry." Elena shook David awake, and together they looked out at their backyard. The hole was definitely there, a perfect cylinder that seemed to descend far deeper than any 10-year-old should have been able to dig. But more disturbing were the sounds coming from its depths. Not animal sounds, but something that might have been music, if music could be played on instruments made from materials that didn't exist in nature. "We're leaving," David said, his voice steady despite the fear Elena could see in his eyes. Right now, pack whatever you can carry." They threw clothes and essentials into suitcases, loaded their car in the pre-dawn darkness, and drove away from the house where they'd planned to raise their children into adulthood. Marcus sat quietly in the back seat, his face pressed to the window, watching their home shrink into the distance. "What did you find down there?" Elena asked him. "Something that wasn't supposed to be found," Marcus replied. "Something that's been waiting a really long time for someone to let it out." The Brennan family never returned to Millbrook. They settled in a city 400 miles away, changed their last name, and never spoke about the house with the oak tree in the backyard. But David kept a Google Earth bookmark for their old address, checking it obsessively every few months to see if their former home was still standing. For 2 years, the satellite images showed the house exactly as they'd left it. Then one morning, the property appeared as an empty lot, the house and oak tree gone, as if they'd never existed. In their place was a perfectly round depression in the earth, maybe 20 feet across, that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The depression remained visible in satellite images for another year before the entire lot was purchased by the town and converted into a small park. But if you knew where to look, you could still see the outline of that original hole, and locals reported that the grass grew differently there, lusher and greener, as if it were being fed by something rich and dark far below the surface. Marcus, now 13 and calling himself by a different name, still had dreams about digging. In those dreams, he was back in Millbrook, standing at the edge of that hole, listening to music that came from depths that had no bottom. And sometimes when he woke from those dreams, he would find dirt under his fingernails and the taste of earth in his mouth, as if some part of him were still digging, still searching for things that were better left buried. The intersection of County Road 47 and Forest Service Road 218 wasn't marked on any official map, but truckers and traveling salesmen had been talking about it in truck stops and diners for decades. Most of the stories were variations on the same theme. A driver would take the shortcut through the Cascade National Forest, expecting to save an hour or two on their route, and would arrive at their destination hours, or sometimes days, later than their GPS had calculated. Sarah Martinez first heard about the crossroads from her dispatcher at Pacific Northwest Logistics, where she'd been driving long-haul routes for 8 years. She was picking up a load of timber from a mill outside Bend, Oregon, and her route back to Seattle took her directly through the National Forest on what should have been a straightforward 4-hour drive. "Just stick to Highway 26, her dispatcher warned. "Don't take any shortcuts through the back roads even if your GPS tells you to. There's something weird about that whole area." But Sarah had always prided herself on finding the most efficient routes, on knowing the roads better than any computer navigation system. When her GPS suggested County Road 47 as a faster alternative, she ignored her dispatcher's warning and took the turn into the forest. The road was well maintained, cutting through stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. Sarah made good time for the first 20 minutes, her truck handling the curves and grades with ease. She was congratulating herself on saving nearly an hour when she reached the crossroads. Forest Service Road 218 intersected County Road 47 at a perfect 90-degree angle, marked by a 4-way stop sign that looked like it had been installed recently. Sarah's GPS showed her location accurately. She was exactly where she expected to be, right on schedule. But something about the intersection felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. The forest was too quiet. For one thing, no bird songs, no insect buzz, no wind through the trees. The silence was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat over the idle of her diesel engine. More unsettling was the quality of the light. Despite her truck's clock reading 3:15 p.m., the shadows fell at angles that suggested either early morning or late evening, and the sun seemed to be shining from a direction that didn't match her internal compass. Sarah consulted her GPS again. According to the screen, she should continue straight on County Road 47 for another 37 miles to reach Highway 26. Simple enough. She shifted into gear and proceeded through the intersection. But 10 minutes later, she found herself approaching the same crossroads again. This time she paid closer attention to the details. The stop sign was definitely the same. She could see the small dent in its lower right corner where someone had hit it with a rock or a BB gun. The pattern of tire tracks in the dirt was identical, right down to the spot where someone had done a burnout, leaving rubber marks in a perfect arc. Sarah checked her odometer. She'd driven exactly 8.3 miles since leaving the intersection the first time, but according to her GPS, she'd somehow looped back to the same coordinates. The device showed her position as accurate, her satellite signal strong, her route clearly marked. She tried taking Forest Service Road 218 to the north, thinking maybe she'd misunderstood her directions. 20 minutes of driving through identical forest brought her back to the crossroads. She tried going south on FSR 218 with the same result. No matter which direction she chose, every road led back to the intersection with the four-way stop. By the fifth loop, Sarah was fighting panic. Her truck's clock showed 4:47 p.m., but the quality of light hadn't changed. The same wrong-angled shadows, the same sunlight that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Her radio picked up nothing but static, and her cell phone showed no signal despite being in an area where she'd always had full coverage. That's when she noticed the trail camera. It was mounted on a pine tree about 30 feet from the intersection, disguised well enough that she might have missed it if she hadn't been looking for anything unusual. The camera was pointed directly at the crossroads, its motion sensor light blinking steadily in the eternal twilight of the forest. Sarah pulled over and approached the device. It was a high-end model, the kind serious hunters used to monitor game trails, with a digital display that showed the date and time of the last recorded motion. According to the screen, the camera had been triggered 847 times in the past 24 hours, all at 3:33 a.m., all showing the same image. Sarah scrolled through the stored photographs. Each one showed the crossroads at night, lit by the camera's infrared flash, and in each one a figure stood at the center of the intersection, tall, motionless, facing a different direction in each successive frame as if slowly rotating in place. The figure looked human from a distance, but something about its proportions was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head too large, and its posture suggested joints that bent in ways human joints shouldn't. Most disturbing of all, in every photograph, the figure cast multiple shadows, not the confused shadows of multiple light sources, but distinct, sharp silhouettes that pointed in impossible directions. Sarah backed away from the trail camera and returned to her truck. She tried the radio again and was surprised to hear a voice crackling through the static, a truck driver reporting his location as somewhere near the crossroads, asking for directions back to the main highway. "How long have you been driving?" Sarah asked into her CB microphone. "Started this morning around 6, came the reply. "Should have been in Portland by noon, but I keep ending up at this damn intersection. GPS shows I'm going in circles, but the roads all look different." Sarah looked at her own clock, 5:23 p.m. She'd been trapped at the crossroads for over 2 hours, but it felt like minutes. More troubling, her truck's odometer showed she'd driven 127 miles since entering the intersection, though she'd never left the immediate area. "There's something wrong with this place," she radioed back. "Time doesn't work right here." "Tell me about it," the other driver replied. "My logbook says I've been driving for 3 days, but I remember starting this morning, and every time I pass through that intersection, my dashboard clock shows 3:33. Sarah looked at her own clock. It read 3:33 p.m., though she was certain it had shown 5:23 just moments before. As night fell, though Sarah couldn't be sure night was actually falling, or if the strange twilight was simply growing darker, she began to see other vehicles at the crossroads. A pickup truck with Nevada plates, its driver leaning against the hood and smoking a cigarette as if he'd been there for hours. A motorcycle rider consulting a paper map under the intersection's single streetlight, which Sarah was certain hadn't been there earlier in the day. None of the other drivers seemed to notice Sarah's truck, despite her attempts to flag them down. They moved through their routines, checking maps, making phone calls, consulting GPS devices, as if they were alone at the crossroads, trapped in their own loops of time and confusion. At 3:33 a.m., for the clock now seemed permanently fixed at that time, Sarah saw the figure from the trail camera photographs. It materialized at the center of the intersection without walking there, as if it had always been standing in that exact spot. Up close, she could see that it wasn't quite human. Its skin had a waxy quality that reflected light wrong, and its eyes were too large and too dark, like pools of oil in a face that might have been carved from wood. The figure turned to look directly at Sarah's truck, and she felt a moment of connection. Not communication exactly, but recognition. The thing at the crossroads knew she was there, knew she was trapped, and in its inhuman features, she saw something that might have been sympathy. Then it was gone, vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, and Sarah's clock began moving again. 3:34 a.m., 3:35, 3:36. Time resumed its normal flow, and when she drove through the intersection one more time, she found herself on Highway 26, exactly where her GPS had promised she would be. The trip to Seattle took 6 hours longer than it should have, but Sarah's logbook showed that she'd arrived exactly on schedule. Her dispatcher noted no delay, her cargo was delivered on time, and according to every official record, she'd taken the fastest possible route through the forest. But Sarah never took County Road 47 again. And when other drivers asked her about shortcuts through the Cascade National Forest, she always told them the same thing her dispatcher had told her: stick to the main highways, no matter what your GPS suggests. Because somewhere in the forest, at an intersection that may or may not exist on any given day, something is waiting at 3:33 a.m. for travelers who take the wrong turn, measuring their progress in loops that spiral inward toward a center that can't be reached by following any earthly road. Frank Kowalski heard them first, at dawn on a Tuesday in early August, while he was checking his water lines along the north pasture. He'd been ranching in the valley for 32 years, ever since he'd bought the failing homestead from the Hendricks family and slowly built it into a modest but profitable operation. He knew every sound his land made: the creak of windmill blades, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of dry grass in the morning breeze. But he'd never heard anything like the high-pitched wailing that rose from the fence line near the old Hendricks place. The sound came from the cedar post that marked the boundary between his property and the abandoned homestead, weathered post that had been standing for 40 years, connected by 3 strands of barbed wire that had seen better decades. Frank approached slowly, trying to locate the source of the noise. As he got closer, the wailing grew louder, more insistent, until it was painful to listen to. The sound was definitely coming from the wood itself, from somewhere deep inside the cedar posts. Frank pressed his ear to one of them and jerked back immediately. The post was vibrating, humming with a frequency that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. That evening, he mentioned the incident to his neighbor, Margaret Chen, whose property adjoined his on the western boundary. Margaret had been in the valley even longer than Frank, inheriting her family's ranch from her father, who'd inherited it from his father before him. If anyone would know about strange sounds in the Mary Ridge Valley, it would be Margaret. "Cedar posts don't make noise," she said, but Frank could see the worry in her weathered face. "Unless they're splitting from the heat, but that would be a cracking sound, not wailing." "This wasn't cracking," Frank insisted. "It was like screaming, like something trapped inside the wood trying to get out." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dust-covered landscape that stretched toward the abandoned Hendricks homestead. "My grandfather used to tell stories about that place," she said finally. "Said there was something wrong with the land where old Hendrick built his house. Said the grass grew too green there, even in dry years." Frank had heard similar stories, the kind of folklore that accumulated around any property that had been abandoned long enough. The Hendricks family had vanished in 1974, leaving behind a partially collapsed farmhouse and outbuildings that had been slowly reclaimed by weather and time. Various rumors had circulated over the years. Hendrick had killed his family and fled. The family had been murdered by drifters. They'd simply packed up and left in the middle of the night without telling anyone. But Frank had never paid much attention to the stories until the fence posts started screaming. The next morning he heard them again, not just the posts along his property line but cedar posts throughout the valley. Margaret Chen called him around 7 a.m., her voice tight with fear. "It's not just your fence," she said. "It's every cedar post on my property. And Frank, I found something else." Margaret met him at the boundary between their properties where the screaming was loudest. She led him to a section of fence about 50 yards from the old Hendricks place, where one of the cedar posts had split open during the night. The crack ran from the ground to the top of the post, revealing the wood's interior. Inside the post, Frank could see something that shouldn't have been there: fabric, faded and rotted, but recognizably human clothing. A small piece of blue cotton that might once have been part of a child's dress. "There's more," Margaret said, her voice barely audible over the wailing that rose from every cedar post in sight. "I checked 3 other split posts this morning. They all have fabric inside them. Clothing, Frank. Children's clothing." That afternoon, Frank called the county sheriff's office. Deputy Martinez arrived 2 hours later, bringing a forensics technician and a grim expression that suggested she'd seen too many strange cases in rural Montana to be surprised by much of anything. "You're telling me there's clothing inside these fence posts?" she asked. "See for yourself," Frank replied, leading her to the split cedar post. Martinez examined the fabric with latex gloves, carefully extracting a larger piece from the crack in the wood. The material was clearly part of a child's garment. A small blue dress with white trim, the kind that might have been worn by a girl in the 1970s. This post has been standing for 40 years. The forensics technician observed. If this fabric was sealed inside when the post was installed, it would have been put there intentionally. But why? Martinez asked. And how many posts are we talking about? Frank and Margaret exchanged glances. They'd been afraid to check, but they both suspected the answer. Over the next 3 days, a team of investigators examined every cedar fence post in the Meriridge Valley. They found fabric in 37 posts, all of it children's clothing from the 1970s. Dresses, shirts, small pants, even tiny shoes that had been somehow compressed and inserted into the wood before the posts were set. More disturbing were the forensics results. DNA analysis of the fabric revealed biological material from at least 8 different children, none of whom matched any missing persons reports from the 1970s. The clothing showed signs of violent damage, tears that suggested struggle, stains that tested positive for human blood. But the children who had worn these clothes had never been reported missing. It was as if they had simply vanished from existence, leaving behind only scraps of fabric sealed inside cedar posts that screamed with their trapped voices. Deputy Martinez expanded her investigation to include the abandoned Hendricks homestead. What she found in the collapsed farmhouse's basement changed everything. The underground room had been carefully constructed, with stone walls and a wooden floor that showed signs of frequent scrubbing. Along one wall stood a workbench containing tools for woodworking, saws, chisels, and a collection of hollow drills designed for boring precise holes in fence posts. More damning was the journal they found hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Henrik Hendricks had recorded everything in meticulous detail. The children he'd taken from neighboring towns, the rituals he'd performed, the belief that sealing their remains inside living wood would somehow preserve their souls for a purpose he never clearly explained. The final entry was dated 3 days before the Hendricks family's disappearance. The posts are ready. The children are calling from inside the wood. Tomorrow we complete the circle and join them in the green darkness that grows beneath the valley. But Martinez never found the Hendricks family's remains. The basement contained evidence of their woodworking operation, their systematic collection of victims, and their obsession with cedar posts that could house human spirits. But Henrik, his wife, and their 2 children had vanished as completely as their victims, leaving behind only the screaming fence posts that marked the boundaries of their terrible work. The county removed all the cedar posts from the valley, but the screaming continued. Ranch hands reported hearing children's voices carried on the wind, calling from fence lines that no longer existed. Cattle avoided certain areas of pasture, huddling together in corners far from the spots where the posts had stood. Frank Kowalski sold his ranch 6 months later and moved to a city where the only posts were metal and concrete, where wood came from lumber yards instead of growing in soil that had been fed with secrets. But sometimes, when the wind was right and the night was quiet, he could still hear those high-pitched wails, the voices of children who had been transformed into something that was neither alive nor dead, forever calling from the spaces between wood grain and the darkness that lives inside growing things. The Meriridge Valley never recovered from the drought. Without the cedar posts to mark property lines, disputes arose between neighbors, and one by one, the remaining families moved away. Today the valley is empty except for the abandoned buildings and the patches of unnaturally green grass that grow where the screaming posts once stood, fed by something buried deeper than roots, nourished by secrets that refuse to stay silent. Emergency dispatcher Lisa Wong had been working the night shift at the County 911 Center for 6 years, and she thought she'd heard everything. Domestic disturbances, heart attacks, car accidents on rural highways where help was 40 minutes away on a good night. But she'd never received a call like the one that came in at 2:17 a.m. on a Thursday in late October. The call appeared on her computer screen as a standard emergency line, no caller ID, but with GPS coordinates that placed the caller in the middle of Dyer's Field, 15 miles east of town. Lisa put on her headset and answered according to protocol. 911, what's your emergency? Silence. But not the silence of a disconnected line. Lisa could hear something on the other end. Wind, maybe, or breathing. And underneath that, a rhythmic sound like footsteps crunching through dry grass. Hello, this is 911 Emergency Services, can you hear me? The footsteps continued, steady and purposeful. Lisa could hear each step distinctly, the crunch of dried vegetation, the subtle shift of weight from heel to toe, the whisper of fabric brushing against itself as someone walked. But no voice answered her questions. She tried for 5 minutes, using every technique she'd learned for coaxing information from callers in crisis. Sometimes people called 911 and couldn't speak, hiding from intruders, choking, having strokes that affected their speech. Lisa had guided dozens of silent callers through emergencies using yes or no questions and phone tones. But this caller never responded. The footsteps never stopped, and the GPS signal remained rock steady, showing the caller's position in the exact center of Dyer's field. Lisa dispatched Deputy Rodriguez to investigate. The field was part of the Dyer family's weed operation, a 1,000-acre spread that had been harvested 3 weeks earlier and burned the following day to clear the stubble. There should have been nothing in that field but ash and bare earth, no crops to hide in, no buildings to shelter an emergency caller, no reason for anyone to be walking through the middle of it at 2 in the morning. Rodriguez arrived at the field 23 minutes after the call began. Lisa stayed on the line, listening to the footsteps that continued with mechanical regularity, never faltering, never changing pace. "I'm at the location," Rodriguez radioed. "There's nobody here. The field's empty, just burned ground and some leftover stubble. No vehicles, no people, no signs that anyone's been here recently." "The call's still active," Lisa replied. "GPS shows the caller right where you are." Rodriguez walked through the field with his flashlight, calling out, checking the perimeter where the burned area met the tree line. Nothing. But Lisa could still hear the footsteps through her headset, could hear the wind that Rodriguez was experiencing from his location. "Wait," Rodriguez said. "I'm hearing something like footsteps, but there's nobody here." The sound was coming from the burned field itself, from the charred earth that couldn't conceal so much as a rabbit. Rodriguez followed the sound toward the center of the field, his flashlight beam sweeping across ground that showed no footprints, no disturbance of any kind. "The sound's getting louder," he reported. "But I swear there's nobody here. It's like the footsteps are coming from underground." Lisa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night. She'd handled thousands of emergency calls, but she'd never had one where the GPS coordinates were accurate, but the caller existed in some space that occupied the same location as reality, but remained invisible to responding officers. "Rodriguez, get out of there," she said. "Something's not right." But Rodriguez was a thorough cop, methodical and professional. He walked to the exact GPS coordinates that Lisa's computer showed as the caller's location, the precise center of the 1,000-acre field, and stood there with his flashlight pointed at the ground. "I'm right on top of the signal," he reported. "The footsteps are so loud I can barely hear myself think, but there's nothing here, nothing at all." That's when the call disconnected. Lisa's computer showed the line going dead at exactly 2:54 a.m., 37 minutes after it had begun. The GPS signal vanished simultaneously, leaving no trace that the call had ever occurred except for the recording in Lisa's system, and Rodriguez standing alone in the middle of a burned wheat field, listening to footsteps that no longer had a source. The next morning, Lisa pulled the audio recording and listened to it again. 37 minutes of steady footsteps, never pausing, never varying in rhythm. She played it for her supervisor, who forwarded it to the State Police Forensic Audio Lab for analysis. The lab report was inconclusive, but disturbing. The footsteps were definitely human, made by someone wearing hard-soled shoes walking across dried vegetation, but the audio contained frequencies that human ears couldn't normally detect, subsonic rumbles that suggested the walker was much larger than any person could be, and ultrasonic elements that painted a picture of movement through space that extended in directions human movement couldn't follow. "It's like listening to a recording of someone walking in a room with more than 3 dimensions, the audio technician explained. "The sound reflects off surfaces that shouldn't exist, bounces back from directions that geometry doesn't allow." Lisa started researching the history of Dyer's field. The land had been in the Dyer family for 4 generations, productive wheat country that had never given them any trouble, but she found newspaper archives that mentioned the field in connection with 2 unsolved disappearances. In 1987, a traveling salesman named Robert Chen had vanished somewhere between the town of Clearwater and his next appointment in Billings. His car was found on the county road that bordered Dyer's field. Engine still running, driver's door open, no sign of where he'd gone. Search teams had combed the area for days without finding any trace of him. 12 years later, a family of 4 from California had disappeared under similar circumstances. The Hendersons had been driving cross-country when their RV was found abandoned on the same stretch of road, with signs that they'd stopped voluntarily and walked away from their vehicle. The RV's engine was off, the doors were locked, and a half-eaten dinner was still warm on the table inside. Both disappearances had occurred during harvest season, when the wheat was mature and tall enough to conceal a person, but search teams had found no trace of any of the missing people, no footprints or belongings, no indication of where they might have gone. Lisa began to wonder if the footsteps she'd heard weren't those of someone calling for help, but of someone or someones who had been walking through Dyer's Field for decades, trapped in a space that existed parallel to the physical world, but remained forever just out of reach. She started monitoring the 911 system more carefully, watching for calls from the GPS coordinates that marked the center of Dyer's Field. Over the next 6 months, she received 4 more calls from the same location, always at night, always during the new moon, always featuring the same steady footsteps crunching through vegetation that had been burned away weeks or months earlier. Lisa never answered those calls. She let them ring through to the automated system, let the computer record 30 or 40 minutes of footsteps walking through a field that existed in the spaces between what was real and what was possible. Because she'd realized that answering those calls might mean joining the footsteps she heard, becoming part of a procession that walked endlessly through dimensions of space and time that human beings were never meant to explore. And late at night, when the 911 center was quiet and Lisa was alone with her headset and her computer screens, she sometimes heard footsteps in the static between calls, the sound of people walking through fields that had been harvested long ago, their voices calling from coordinates that led to places no GPS could map. The official record stated that the town of Cedar Hollow, Montana, had experienced a coordinated electrical failure on the night of March 15, 1986, resulting in a fire that destroyed half the downtown area and led to the temporary evacuation of the community's 347 residents. But the residents of Cedar Hollow knew the truth was far stranger than any electrical failure could explain. Janet Patterson had been the town librarian for 15 years when the clock stopped. She remembered the exact moment it happened, 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday night in March, because she'd been working late, cataloging a shipment of books that had arrived from the state library system in Helena. The grandfather clock in the library's main room had been chiming the quarter hour when its pendulum simply stopped swinging, as if the mechanism had been seized by an invisible hand. Within minutes, every timepiece in Cedar Hollow fell silent. Digital clocks went dark, analog clocks froze, and the bell tower at St. Mary's Church, which had chimed every hour for 60 years, became as mute as the mountains that surrounded the valley. But the clock stopping wasn't the strangest part. What happened next defied every natural law Janet thought she understood. At exactly 3:17 a.m., though no working clock remained to mark the time, every resident of Cedar Hollow began sleepwalking. Janet found herself standing in the town square, still wearing her nightgown and slippers, surrounded by her neighbors who had emerged from their homes with the same dreamy, purposeful expression. Old Henrik Johansson stood next to Mayor Davidson, both men staring at the clock tower with identical vacant smiles. Mrs. Chen held hands with her twin daughters, all 3 moving in perfect synchronization toward the center of the square. The entire population of Cedar Hollow had gathered in front of the town hall, arranged in concentric circles around a point that seemed to pulse with invisible energy. Janet retained enough consciousness to recognize her neighbors, to understand that something unprecedented was happening, but she felt no alarm. The sleepwalking felt natural, necessary, as if she'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. Then they began to dig. Without tools, without discussion, without any apparent coordination, the residents of Cedar Hollow began excavating a pit in the center of the town square. They used their hands, their fingernails, improvised scoops made from clothing and shoes. The earth came away easily, as if it had been waiting to be moved, and Janet found herself passing handfuls of dirt in a bucket brigade that stretched from the growing pit to the edges of the square. The digging continued until dawn, when the first rays of sunlight broke the spell that had gripped the town. Janet woke to find herself standing waist-deep in a perfectly circular excavation, her hands bloody from clawing at packed earth, her nightgown torn and filthy. Around her, her neighbors were stirring from the same trance, looking at each other with the confused expressions of people waking from a shared dream. But the pit remained, 20 feet across and 8 feet deep, with walls so perfectly smooth they might have been carved by machine. At the bottom lay every clock, watch, and timepiece from the town of Cedar Hollow, hundreds of devices that had somehow been collected and deposited while their owners slept. Mayor Davidson organized a town meeting that afternoon, but no one could explain what had happened. The residents remembered the sleepwalking, remembered the compulsion to dig, remembered the feeling that they were participating in something larger than themselves. But no one could say why they'd been driven to bury every timepiece in Cedar Hollow. "We should dig them out," suggested Pete Kowalski, who ran the hardware store. "Get them repaired, put them back where they belong." But when a volunteer crew descended into the pit, they found that the clocks had fused together into a single mass. Metal and plastic and glass melted and reformed into a sculpture that hurt to look at directly. The shape seemed to shift when no one was watching, rearranging itself into configurations that suggested the passage of time through dimensions human minds couldn't grasp. Worse, anyone who spent more than a few minutes near the buried clocks began to experience temporal distortions. Volunteers would climb down into the pit and emerge hours later, convinced they'd only been below ground for minutes. Others aged visibly during their brief exposure to the fused timepieces, their hair graying and their skin wrinkling as if years had passed in moments. Dr. Patricia Wong, the town's only physician, documented dozens of cases of what she called chronological displacement, residents who lost hours or days from their memories, children who aged backwards, elderly people who briefly regained the vigor of their youth before snapping back to their actual ages with violent, painful suddenness. The decision to permanently seal the pit was unanimous. The town council voted to fill the excavation with concrete, then soil, then to plant grass over the site as if it had never existed. But they couldn't quite bring themselves to forget what lay beneath the surface. A year later, Cedar Hollow was struck by the fire that made the official records. It started simultaneously in 12 different buildings, spreading too quickly for the volunteer fire department to contain. By morning, half the town was gone, including the town hall, the library, and the church with its silent bell tower. The fire burned in patterns that defied physics, consuming some buildings completely while leaving adjacent structures untouched. Most strange of all, the flames seemed to follow the underground location of the buried clocks, as if something beneath the surface was guiding their path. Janet Patterson lost her library in the fire, but she saved the most important books, the ones that documented Cedar Hollow's history, including her own careful record of the night the clocks stopped. She moved to Helena after the fire, taking a job at the state library, but she never stopped researching temporal anomalies and chronological disturbances. What she discovered was a pattern of similar events stretching back centuries. Towns where clocks stopped simultaneously, communities that experienced collective sleepwalking episodes, places where time moved differently than it did in the surrounding world. Always the pattern was the same: the timepieces would be buried, the community would try to return to normal, and eventually something would happen. Fires, floods, mass evacuations that scattered the residents and left the buried clocks undisturbed. Janet theorized that time itself was not the constant that human beings believed it to be, that there were places where the flow of temporal energy pooled and eddied like water in a stream. The clocks, she believed, were not measuring time but channeling it, and when too many chronometers gathered in one location, they could disrupt the natural flow of causality itself. Cedar Hollow was rebuilt after the fire, but the new residents were outsiders, people who had no connection to the events of 1986. They installed modern digital clocks, electronic timers, atomic synchronized timepieces that promised accuracy to the nanosecond. But sometimes, late at night when the wind was right, the new residents reported hearing sounds from beneath the town square, the muffled ticking of hundreds of clocks, counting down to midnight in a temporal dimension that existed parallel to normal time. And once a year, on the anniversary of the night the clocks stopped, the descendants of Cedar Hollow's original families received the same dream, a vision of themselves standing in concentric circles around a pit that contained all the time that had ever been lost, all the moments that had slipped between seconds, all the hours that existed in the spaces between heartbeats. In the dream they were still digging, still burying the instruments that measured time, still protecting the world from the knowledge that time was not a river flowing in one direction, but an ocean, with depths that human consciousness was never meant to explore.